Hello everyone, I hope you're doing very well. This is week 7, and this is a very exciting week. Week 8, next week, we'll be meeting in person. How delightful. I'm super excited. I hope you're super excited. This week, we're talking about the introductions of our speeches, of our presentations, of our lessons, and some different methods, effective methods of making those introductions. So we're going to talk about them. I've got lots of example videos, and so bear with me on that. Hopefully it's interesting and exciting, and next week, in week 8, we're going to use these methods along with the ones we've learned before and synthesize them into speeches and conversations and practicing, and I'm super excited to see you in person. Anyways, let's dive in. With that, let's talk about making introductions. A strong introduction hooks your audience, makes them want to keep paying attention. So it's very important to make a strong introduction. So it's important with our lessons that a strong introduction, a strong opening phase is very important for making students interested in our lessons. So let's look at some different methods we can use. These are for speeches mostly, but they are going to be used in our class. Let's take a look. First, attention grabbers, making a big, bold statement to grab the listener's attention. This is something that's short, but loud and strong. So you're going to make the strong assertion and then prove it with the rest of your presentation. We'll have some examples of this. We're going to have example videos for everything. We'll talk about each of this. So let's take a look at some strong introductions, attention grabbers.
Good morning, Mr. Beale. They tell me you're a madman.
Only desultorily.
How are you now?
I'm as mad as a hatter.
Who is it? I'm going to take you into our conference room. Seems more seemly a setting for what I have to say to you. I started as a salesman, Mr. Beale. I sold sewing machines and automobile parts, hairbrushes, and electronic equipment. They say I can sell anything. I'd like to try to sell something to you. Valhalla, Mr. Beale. Please sit down. You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it. Is that clear? You think you merely stopped a business deal? That is not the case. The Arabs have taken billions of dollars out of this country, and now they must put it back. It is ebb and flow, tidal gravity. It is ecological balance. You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, Reichmarks, rims, rubles, pounds, and shekels. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things today. That is the atomic and subatomic and galactic structure of things today. And you have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone.
All right, now this is a very, well, I don't know if it's still very famous, but it was very famous monologue. And this is just the opening part. This is the introduction. He is big and boastful and yelling, really, and yelling that the listener, the audience, has sinned, has done some great bad thing. So they need to atone. They need to make up for their bad actions. So with that, we see this is attention grabbing. He's yelling. He's powerful. He has a spotlight on. We see this a lot in dramatic, we want something to be very dramatic and very loud and proud kind of thing. So this is an excellent example of how to grab someone's attention and grab the audience's attention through loud and boastfulness. Now, as teachers, we're working with students and young students. This might not be the best way. And also, not everyone responds to getting yelled at, to be honest. It depends on the setting, on the situation. We have to know when to do it. But this yelling, we see this, in different ways, in different kinds of presentations. And this is a very nice example of one of those attention-grabbing ways of starting a presentation. We're going to watch a little bit more of the next part, and you can see how he changes, how the speaker changes drastically from this attention-grabbing to much more direct and conversational. It's a very stark transition.
Am I getting through to you, Mr. Beale? You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. What do you think the Russians talk about in their councils of state? Karl Marx? They get out their linear programming charts, statistical decision theories, Minimax solutions, and compute the price-cost probabilities of their transactions and investments, just like we do. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime. And our children will live, Mr. Beale, to see that perfect world in which there's no war or famine, oppression or brutality. One vast and ecumenical holding company for whom all men will work to serve a common profit, in which all men will hold a share of stock, all necessities provided, all anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused. And I have chosen you, Mr. Beale, to preach this evangel.
Why me?
Because you're on television, dummy. 60 million people watch you every night of the week, Monday through Friday.
I have seen the face of God.
You just might be right, Mr. Beale.
Another method is adding a quote to emphasize your topic. This is important, that the quote should be related, tied into your presentation. And it should also not be too long. We don't need to, have a whole paragraph. We don't need a 100-word quote. It should be short and impactful. So, for example, you can say, Sam Walton once said, "You can't just keep doing what works one time. Everything around you is changing. To succeed, stay out in front of change." that quote, it's from Sam Walton. He was a businessman. He made the company Walmart, which we don't have in Korea. We used to have, but we don't have now. But it's a big hypermart, Daehyun Mart. Anyways, he said that, you do something once and it works. It doesn't mean it's going to work again, because the world changes and you need to change with it and stay in front of that change so you're ready for things. And that's true for life and true for us as teachers. We need to keep learning what works with one group, what works in 1 year doesn't mean it will work 10 years later. So, my references to, what were the groups? To 2 p.m. and Big Bang. I can't make, elementary school kids don't know who they are anymore. So, yeah, in a small example. But let's take a look at some good examples of using quotes as an introduction.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in a 1968 speech where he reflects upon the civil rights movement, states, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." As a teacher, I've internalized this message. Every day, all around us, we see the consequences of silence manifest themselves in the form of discrimination, violence, genocide, and war. In the classroom, I challenge my students to explore the silences in their own lives through poetry. We work together to fill those spaces, to recognize them, to name them, to understand that they don't have to be sources of shame. In an effort to create a culture within my classroom where students feel safe sharing the intimacies of their own silences, I have 4 core principles posted on the board that sits in the front of my class, which every student signs at the beginning of the year. Read critically, write consciously, speak clearly, tell your truth. I find myself thinking a lot about that last point, tell your truth. And I realized that if I was going to ask my students to speak up, I was going to have to tell my truth and be honest with them about the times where I failed to do so. So I'd tell them that growing up, as a kid in a Catholic family in New Orleans, during Lent, I was always taught that the most meaningful thing one could do was to give something up, sacrifice something you typically indulge in to prove to God you understand His sanctity. I've given up soda, McDonald's, French fries, French kisses, and everything in between. But one year, I gave up speaking. Figured the most valuable thing I could sacrifice was my own voice, but it was like I hadn't realized that I had given that up a long time ago. I had spent so much of my life telling people the things they wanted to hear instead of the things they needed to. Told myself I wasn't meant to be anyone's conscience because I still had to figure out being my own, so sometimes I just wouldn't say anything, appeasing ignorance with my silence, unaware that validation doesn't need words to endorse its existence. When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my locker for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I had put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, merely searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with touching the screen of my Apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids," I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money more than my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flaws gut-wrench guillotine your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian that he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman that my students can talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau, and just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you've ever needed is your voice? Thank you.
All right, that's a very short speech, actually, but only 4.5 minutes. But it opens with the quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. Very well. I know you've heard a bit about him, but was very influential and inspirational figure in American modern history, and has been largely promoted to demigod, sainthood status. But that's a nice way. He's using the quote as a framing device about his theme of silence and what it means to be silent, and what it means to speak out. And so he starts with that quote and then works around it and builds around it from. So this is a nice, pretty short example of how we can use a quote effectively as a starting point and as a framing device for our speeches, for our presentations. Let's check into the next way of of introducing ourselves. Another method is using a brief introduction of who you are and establish credibility. And this will help the audience understand why they should listen to you. What's special about you that makes what you have to say important? There's a lot of very good examples, but it is, this is something that from reading, informal studies, that men respond to quite a lot. We don't care who you are, we care what you are. Why should we listen to you? What are you an expert of? If we're watching a YouTube video about, bicycle maintenance and repair, it's important to know who this person is, the YouTuber. If they're just some jerk from the street who rides a bike, why should we listen to them? If they're a bike shop owner and they're a certified mechanic, well, that's different. And they have 20 years of experience. That's also very different. So what they say has credibility. It's also why we take someone who has a Harvard University degree and diploma more seriously than someone from, say, the University of Idaho, as an example.
On my business card, I am a corporate president. In my mind, I am a game developer. But in my heart, I am a gamer.
All right, this is a very short clip. This entire speech by Shigeru Iwata, he's a former president of Nintendo. This is it's a 90-minute speech. So while the previous quotation introduction about quotations, we could watch the entire performance of that. For him, we're using absolute segments, and that's his introducing opener. He's saying on his business card he is a president of a large company. In his mind, he's a game developer, which is true. That's what his career was, developing Nintendo games. And in his heart, he is a gamer. And that is who he is, establishes his credibility of who he is and why he is qualified to talk at the GDC, the Game Developers Conference. And you can hear the rapturous applause there. Let's take a look at this other example that is similar, but it wasn't as well received at the time of self-deprecation credibility, of establishing credibility. Let's take a quick look at this other example.
Admiral Stockdale, your opening statement, please, sir.
Who am I? Why am I here? I'm not a politician, everybody knows that, so don't expect me to use the language of the Washington Insider. 37 years in the Navy, and only one of them up there in Washington. And now I'm an academic.
Now this is an example of a bad establishment of credibility. Admiral Stockdale, he was in the U.S. Navy for 37 years. He said now he's an academic. He retired, now he's working in university. This is for the vice presidential debate in 1992, so it's a political debate. And he starts with a joke saying, "Who am I? Why am I here?" And, you know, it got laughter, but it wasn't the right introduction at the time. It doesn't send the impression of competence. It doesn't establish why he is a smart guy. Even if he's not a politician, it doesn't establish that he's competent or intelligent, which is, you know, at the time wasn't what was needed. So we have to be careful when we try to establish credibility that we actually do establish why we know what we're talking about. Don't try to joke about it too much, or else we'll send the wrong impression about what we're trying to say. Another method is to ask a rhetorical question to show your presentation's point. As in, this is a big question that you don't expect the audience to answer, but you will answer through your presentation. And your goal is to get them to think and engage with the presentation. And we have some examples here.
We start with a simple question. Does my pet really love me, or does she just want a treat? Obviously, she really loves us. Obviously, right? How do we know what's really going on in those furry little heads? Something is going on. And why is the question always, do they love me? Why is it always about us? Why are we such narcissists? I have a different question. Who are you? That's a better question for animals, I think. We have things going on in our minds that we tend to assume are the exclusive abilities of humans. But there are other brains out there. Some of them are very big. What are they doing with those big brains? Can they think? Can they feel? How can we possibly find a way into that question? Well, there are ways in. We can look at the brain, we can look at evolution, and we can look at behaviors.
Here in this speech, we see some very big questions. It's like, does my dog really love me? But really, the speaker asserts that the real question is, who are you? That's another big question. And throughout this speech, throughout this talk, he's going to establish how we can measure intelligence and consciousness and all the empathy, all those things that he mentioned. But this is an excellent way of establishing the question and then asking the real question of the point of his speech, and then he's going to address it throughout the rest of his speech. And so this is an excellent way of asking an intriguing question that brings in the audience, and then he'll try to answer that question throughout. Another method is to list a few noteworthy facts to emphasize your topic. So one or two facts or statistics we brought in before that show the value of your presentation. And this is something that the best facts are the ones that your audience won't know but will find thought-provoking or relevant or scary or shocking in some way. Don't use too many facts that will obscure your message. But this next example really shows it's a great example of this method of introduction.
Here is a little snapshot of the bizarre times in which we find ourselves. 21% of American adults are functionally illiterate. That means 43 million people. In the UK, 16% of adults are functionally illiterate. In Germany, it's 14%. This video explains what that means and why that might be. With me, some guy.
Right, this is a very nice introduction that's quite shocking, talking about functional illiteracy in adult populations in America and the UK, and that's what he's going to talk about in this video. And this is another example of establishing credibility in that he has no credibility. He's just some guy. He's just, as he explains in the video, he was shocked that the numbers were so high, that so many people, so many adults are functionally illiterate. So it's quite something. Now let's take a look at another speech, a bit more famous, that also uses some statistics to help start off in its presentation.
I am delighted to be here, and I'm particularly delighted to be here on this occasion. We meet at a college noted for knowledge, in a city noted for progress, in a state noted for strength, and we stand in need of all three. For we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. The greater our knowledge increases, the greater our ignorance unfolds. Despite the striking fact that most of the scientists that the world has ever known are alive and working today, despite the fact that this nation's own scientific manpower is doubling every 12 years in a rate of growth more than 3 times that of our population as a whole, despite that, the vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension. No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. And now, if America's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venus, we will have literally reached the stars before midnight tonight. This is a breathtaking pace, and such a pace cannot help but create new ills as it dispels old.
Now, this speech is it's a long part of a longer one. It's a segment of a longer speech. It's quite famous. But here, he's using, statistics and facts, but also metaphors to try to explain, the challenges of the 20th century, of the mid-20th century. At the time, it's 1962, I believe, when he made the speech. And he's trying to explain how much progress has been made, and how we make progress. We solve old problems, but we find new ones, or we make new ones and new challenges. And so in this speech, he's trying to show how fast humanity has moved, but also, how much there's still left to do, how much challenge there is left still to face. So he's trying to persuade the audience, but he's starting his speech with these facts to draw the picture of what's facing, what the challenges are, what the problem is. And as the speech continues, he's going to offer the solution. The solution is it's money for NASA, basically. So he'll talk about that. So it's a famous speech, to say the least. I believe I'll include the entire thing in our week's material because it is quite helpful to hear the whole part. All right, let's keep going. Another method is sharing a short story to make the presentation relatable. Personal anecdotes and stories from other people make for good introductions. Keep it short, but use it as a point of transition to the rest of your introduction. A well-crafted story leads a personal touch that people will relate to and understand. Some people, some very good speakers, they don't finish the story in their introduction. They weave the story in throughout their presentation, and that's quite effective, and we can see an example, some very good examples here.
I'm honored to be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots. I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. So why'd I drop out? It started before I was born. My biological mother was a young, unwed graduate student, and she decided to put me up for adoption. She felt very strongly that I should be adopted by college graduates, so everything was all set for me to be adopted at birth by a lawyer and his wife. Except that when I popped out, they decided at the last minute that they really wanted a girl. So my parents, who were on a waiting list, got a call in the middle of the night asking, "We've got an unexpected baby boy. Do you want him?" They said, "Of course." My biological mother found out later that my mother had never graduated from college and that my father had never graduated from high school. She refused to sign the final adoption papers. She only relented a few months later when my parents promised that I would go to college. This was the start in my life. And 17 years later, I did go to college. But I naively chose a college that was almost as expensive as Stanford. And all of my working class parents' savings were being spent on my college tuition. After 6 months, I couldn't see the value in it. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. It was pretty scary at the time, but looking back, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked far more interesting. It wasn't all romantic. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them. If I had never dropped out, I would have never dropped in on that calligraphy class, and personal computers might not have the wonderful typography that they do. Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever. Because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart, even when it leads you off the well-worn path. And that will make all the difference.
All right, this opening from the commencement speech by Steve Jobs, oh my goodness, 16 years ago, is he's telling it 3 stories, but again, we don't have time for the whole speech. But this opening illustrates how a story from his university about dropping out of the formal studies allowed him to learn what he was interested in, or what he had a passing fancy, and how that what he learned became essential to the success of Apple 10 years later, and how he connecting the dots. And we don't know how it's going to work out. We just have to have the confidence that it will work out, that it will connect together. So it's a very nice introduction to a story to young graduates of university. I want to share another example, and this was from the speech by Shigeru Iwata, and he explains about him learning to love games and a bit of his story, and it provides a very nice another part of introduction to his speech.
Today, I'd like to speak to you from my heart about our jobs and about our industry. I remember the first video game I ever played. It was Pong, and I loved it. By the time I was in high school, I was the first person in my class to buy an early Hewlett-Packard pocket calculator. I think I was one of the original early adapters. But where most people use their calculators for higher mathematics, I used mine to program video games. My first creation was a baseball game. I don't think anyone can say it has bad graphics because it has no graphics. Gameplay was represented only by numbers. But when I saw my friends playing that game and having fun, it made me feel proud. To me, this was a source of energy and passion. As that passion for games began to blossom, I think my life course was set.
Yes, we can see here, he established credibility. In my on my business card, I'm a corporate president. In my mind, I'm a game designer, and in my heart, I'm a gamer. And here he tells a story about falling in love with video games, playing them, then developing his first video game in high school. And that this continues on and on. This whole speech is 90 minutes long. It's very long. They play video games and all that stuff. But anyways, this first part's quite nice. Because yes, it's introducing his philosophy. In his speech, it established. He talks about his philosophy about making games, about video games, from a corporate point of view and from the player point of view, which he is both, and he appreciates both experiences. So it's a very nice way of establishing his personal history with the subject and how much it means to him. So it's a very nice introduction. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is week 7 introduction, some different methods of introduction, some different styles, different ways we can introduce our speeches, hopefully. I think you knew some of them, but maybe not. I don't know what you know. And invariably, some students know everything, and invariably, some students haven't learned this at all. So it all can be quite... it's quite a chore to try to equal things out, level it out. Next week, we're going to take all we've learned so far in these first 7 weeks, and we're going to put them into practice. You're going to talk to each other, learn about each other. I don't think you know each other very well, or I don't know that you know that. So we'll be doing some different in-class activities for our 2 hours together. It's going to be honest, a bit exhausting because we haven't been having in-person classes. So hopefully we'll get back into practice, into classroom conditioning, and be really raring to go. So hopefully you're staying healthy, and we're all vaccinated, or mostly vaccinated, or whatever it may be. And we'll see each other again. Not again, excuse me. We'll see each other for the first time next week, next Tuesday or Thursday, depending on which class we are in. So please take care. Please make sure to check on eClass, that everything's up to date, and we'll see each other again in class, in person, next week. All right. Thank you very much. Have a lovely time, and goodbye.